Howdy folks, I'm just recording this after the fact, but I wanted to throw in a quick disclaimer here. This is not a review of Resident Evil 7 in the traditional sense. It's more using it kind of like a video essay to discuss Resident Evil 8. With that in mind, there will be full spoilers for Resident Evil 7, so that's just something to be aware of if you haven't played it. Back to the video. Howdy folks, I am your Princess ChaoticAyana. You are all beautiful, and if you are watching this when it comes out, we are less than 24, even probably less than 12 hours away from the release of Resident Evil Village. Oh, Resident Evil 8, as I keep finding myself calling it. Now, if you watched last week's video, you will know that I played through Resident Evil 6, and I said I was going to play through Resident Evil 7 this week, which I did, and I was expecting this video to be kind of a retrospective. But the more I played through 7, the more I found I kind of had a few concerns about 8 based on what I was playing. So let's take a look. This goes without saying, but Resident Evil 7 is and was an amazing game in my opinion. It took concepts from amazing indie games in their own right like Outlast and combined them with this amazing re-engine, which incidentally only this week I discovered does not stand for Resident Evil Engine but rather Reach for the Moon Engine, and that logo makes a lot more sense to me now. Anyway, Resident Evil 7 was an awesome game that revitalized the Resident Evil franchise. Or did it? See, the thing I love most about Resident Evil 7 is its setting, and for all the other horror references and Easter eggs the game has, nothing shines through as an influence more than the 1974 classic Texas Chainsaw Massacre. From the dinner table scene to how putrid and run down the Baker house looks generally, it's all drawn, and very successfully so, from that sort of deep south horror genre that Texas Chainsaw started. Here is my thing though, okay? You can only do that once. Now, yeah, before anyone says it to me, I am well aware that that is not where Resident Evil 8 is set. But that's kind of my point. I just think the vibe is a lot scarier if you're doing that deep south horror thing, that really grounded feeling, than it is if you're off in the Carpathians somewhere doing a werewolves and vampires adventure. Maybe it's because I grew up watching the Hammer horrors and it all feels kind of glib now. I don't know. The point I'm getting at is just from the trailers and the demos, Resident Evil 7 had a much scarier vibe to it than I feel 8 does. And I'm aware this is completely opinion based, but hell, it's my video. You're going to be getting my opinion, okay? There are a myriad of interesting characters in the Resident Evil franchise, but I would argue none more so than the Bakers from 7. You've got the maniacal patriarch Jack, you've got the enigmatic Lucas, and the just plain bizarre Marguerite. They not only make for memorable adversaries, but they also have some of the most unique visuals in a video game, let alone the Resident Evil franchise. I mean, when else have you seen an elderly woman turned into a spider-like creature that has an insect hive growing out of its crotch? All that said, you know who was least memorable to me in the game? Mia. Despite giving us a memorable opening to the game, she's more or less a MacGuffin to get us into the house. And then we have our protagonist Ethan, whose only defining character trait is a really baffling dedication to a woman that ghosted him 3 years ago. Seriously, if you got the messages he got at the start of the game, you just call the cops. You know, and it goes with the territory of going into first-person perspective like 7 did, but I couldn't tell you what Ethan looks like. I certainly couldn't pick him out in a crowd, but him and Mia are who we're going into Resident Evil 8 with, except it's not, because according to all the trailers, Mia's dead. So we've got a black hole of charisma I couldn't physically describe to you and a dead woman, and those are the interesting characters we're continuing forward with. Well, them and Chris Redfield, but let's talk about that. I was in fact almost going to give this its own entire section, but I'm trying to give my concerns in this video without straying too much into broad conjecture about what 8 will be like. So what I will say is this. Resident Evil 7 is often called a total reboot of the franchise. That is entirely incorrect. The DLC from 7, and we're going to talk about that in more detail in a minute, very much ties the game universe to the wider RE franchise. And if I'm honest, I could have done without it doing so, because it just felt like they were desperately jumping through hoops. And if we're going to introduce werewolves and vampires into what was once a fairly grounded series, I mean, okay, yeah, a virus probably did it, but a clean break would have been better, in my opinion. Resident Evil has always been at its worst as a franchise when it's doing stuff for no other reason than service to the brand, and I hope 8 doesn't feel the same obligation to do that. So I'm not going to repeat myself too much here because I've said all this already in the video, but Resident Evil 7 is at its strongest when it is giving you that grounded horror sense. It's truly at its best when you're being chased by one of the Baker family. Now, the thing about that is, it leaves an elephant in the room, which is the game's last 20%. Let's talk about it. Okay, so I'll admit this is the fairly standard Resident Evil format. You start off in a spooky mansion, then lab. You start off in a zombie-infested city, then lab. You start off in a village that seems to have been time-warped from circa 1950 Spain, and then lab. So the fact that in Resident Evil 7 you end up on a giant boat that was ground zero of the outbreak as opposed to a lab could be considered somewhat of a refreshing change. And I do want to make it clear, I don't think the change in setting itself is all that bad. It's just that the last section of the game accentuates the flaws the game has. This is lacking having any of the bakers in it, and I am sad to say the combat. This might be the most controversial thing I have to say this entire video, but the non-baker enemies in Resident Evil 7 and the combat generally, they aren't good. First off, and I'll only mention this briefly because the RE8 demo does give me the feeling that this has been fixed, there are essentially 3 different types of enemy in Resident Evil 7 that aren't bosses, and that's it. And of those 3, they're all the same thing except one's standard, one's squatting, and one's fat. I will say, it makes absolute sense from a perspective of the game's story, but when you get to the ending section and the game floods you with these enemies, it's really noticeable. By far the worst problem, because this one does seem to have been inherited by Resident Evil 8, at least according to the demos, etc, etc. Capcom have never been sure what to do about the first-person perspective, making it easier to aim. So headshots don't really do a huge amount, and every enemy is a bullet sponge. It is odd that it's carried over as well, because Resident Evil 7 certainly seems to be aware of this by the very end, after the boat in the mine. It clearly wants to flood you with bad guys, but it is aware that it couldn't give you remotely the amount of ammunition you'd require to get through all that without looking a little bit stupid. So it starts giving you these remote bombs, which are suddenly a thing that start existing in the game after several hours, and it gives you dozens of them. The whole thing just comes off as really unsatisfying, and it absolutely kills that horror vibe, just at the very end there. Now, I don't want to speculate too much here, but I have played the Resident Evil Village demo, and yeah, this still feels like it's going to be a problem. It's something Capcom haven't quite managed to work around. I could be wrong, but it's definitely a concern. So a little fourth wall break for you here, folks. I normally outline these scripts on a Friday, and then I write the full script on a Monday and record on the Tuesday. I mention this because over the weekend, this section has changed several times. Let me explain. So it was seemingly revealed, although I can't locate by whom, I'd guess there are some review copies floating around at this point, that Resident Evil 8 will be approximately 10 hours long. And oh, people have gotten themselves absolutely enraged by this fact. Now, to me, that sounds a teeny bit longer than 7, at least on a first playthrough, but also about the maximum length I would want from a single-player horror title. I just don't believe you can give a horror story the pace it needs at anything over that length, and in the cases that I've tried, it's been to the detriment both of the gameplay and the atmosphere. At the risk of putting on my pretentious princess tiara, and by the gods try saying that 3 times fast, I think a good horror stems from fear of the unknown, and I think that works doubly well if it's the unknown in a familiar setting, say a family home like the Bakers. Resident Evil 7 is absolutely perfect at that, and its length is important because you don't want the unknown concepts to become familiar as well, or that's when it stops being scary. That said, Resident Evil 7 comes off these days feeling a little bit anemic in its main campaign to me, and it's because of the DLC. Something I loved, and one of the more unique concepts from Resident Evil 7, was finding various videotapes lying around that you could watch for essential clues and tips, people who'd been here before and maybe seen things you hadn't. It always felt weird to me though that there was basically one tape to every VCR you found, and there were only about 2 or 3 of those in the entire game. Then the DLC came along and included 4 additional ones, for a price of course. I will freely admit I am going into full-on speculation mode here, but either those tapes were originally ones you could find just by playing through the main story and got removed so they could be DLC that you paid for, or the developers made a really unwise decision to use the exact same videotape aesthetic for both the tapes in-game and the tapes that are DLC. I do doubt it's that last one though, because it would be a baffling decision considering there are 2 DLCs that don't use that motif in the slightest. I'm not going to have a go at the game for having DLC here, that's just the way of the AAA gaming world at this point, even though End of Zoe felt like it was kind of going off the rails a little bit. What I don't like is the feeling that I'm being taken advantage of. And if I get the feeling after the fact that you've taken something out of the main story to sell it to me as DLC, that's going to hurt the main story the next time I play through it. I will freely admit, it's speculation on my part, I could be totally wrong, but if I am, it was a baffling design decision to make them look the way they did. Now, thus far, Resident Evil 8 does not have any announced DLC that I can find. It has a deluxe edition, but that doesn't contain any. It also contains things like the Mercenary mode, whereas we got the extra mode sold to us as DLC for Resident Evil 7. So these are all good signs, but I won't hold out hope that something like this isn't going to happen again. We'll see. So folks, that is why Resident Evil 7 makes me concerned about Resident Evil Village. I will say, like I said at the start of the video, we're only a few hours away from it launching now, and I try so hard not just to do pessimism on this channel. I know it'd get me more views, but I don't want to do it. I played the Resident Evil 8 demo, the stars aligned and I was able to find out when I was actually supposed to play the damn thing, and I very much enjoyed it. So what I am hoping is that next week I can come on, review Resident Evil 8 and tell you all that I was absolutely wrong about every single one of my concerns. Hopefully that is going to be the case, folks. I will see you all then. Until next week, I have been your Princess ChaoticAyana. Enjoy Resident Evil 8 if you're getting it at launch. I will see you all next week. Peace. I'm out.